We love Star Wars and you should too. Today we're going to be talking about the Star Wars timeline that is still considered canon. Now, just so you understand what happened, once Disney acquired the rights to Star Wars, the whole expanded universe that had been building for years was turned into Legends. Disney has been hard at work releasing new material to build a solid timeline. So we thought we would tell you a bit about this new timeline. So get ready for a knowledge dump of canon timeline as it stands at the end of 2015. The new canon timeline starts with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, where we get to see the start of the Skywalker legacy. We all remember that movie, and maybe even a few of us liked it. But following that is the Obi-Wan and Anakin comic run, which is set to come out early next year. It's going to follow the two of them on their adventures that happened between Episode 1 and 2, which of course brings us to the next thing in the timeline, Episode 2, Attack of the Clones. Everything up to this point is pretty easy to understand and follow. But things get tricky after this because the Clone Wars TV show didn't like to keep things in order time-wise with each episode. From what I understand in an interview with one of the producers, George Lucas liked to tell things out of order. He liked to tell prequels after telling the main storyline. I guess we all saw what happened when he did episode 4, 5, and 6 and then 1, 2, and 3. Anyway, technically in the timeline, season 2, episode 16 takes place before anything else in the TV show. It's then followed by season 1, episode 16, and finally the animated movie Star Wars The Clone Wars. Then, to just make things a tad more confusing, season 3's episodes 1 and 3 take place after the movie. Then from there, the Clone Wars TV show has a few misplaced episodes in each season, but it mainly stays on track from seasons 1 through 6, finally ending with the unfinished episodes that came out right after Disney acquired the rights to Star Wars. It is called the unfinished episodes for a very good reason, because they were shown only on StarWars.com as is, and they never really got the final touches like a normal episode would have. Now, the Clone Wars TV show and what happened during the actual war is the most confusing part of the entire timeline, so luckily it happened right at the start. Next up in the timeline is a short story that was published in the Star Wars Insider called Kindred Spirits, which served as a prequel to the novel Dark Disciples, which just so happens to be next in the timeline. This is where we have a potential inclusion, because I've seen two timelines, one that says it is and one that says it isn't. But it's the Dark Horse Comics Darth Maul, son of Dathomir. The reason these Dark Horse comics got to stay in the timeline is because they were taken from unaired scripts of the Clone Wars TV show, which would have been a part of season 6, but it got canceled. After all of that confusing stuff that came with the Clone Wars and the possible inclusion of the Dark Horse comics, we have the story of Kanan Jarrus, which takes place in the comic Kanan and is titled The First Blood. This takes place right before the events of Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, which is next in the timeline. Right after Revenge of the Sith comes another Kanan storyline, which starts off in the first issue of the Kanan comic, and it runs 6 issues. It's titled The Last Padawan. Then there's a few novels, starting with The Lords of the Sith, followed by Tarkin and A New Dawn. The next novel is a bit more confusing because it starts before the original trilogy, but it also goes into it as well. That novel is Lost Stars. And finally, the Star Wars Rebels cartoon starts taking place at this point with 4 shorts that they put out before the release of season 1. And then they have a 1-hour TV movie, Star Wars Rebels Spark of Rebellion, followed by season 1 of Star Wars Rebels, which luckily all the episodes happen to stay in order, unlike the previous TV show. Season 2 starts off with another 1-hour TV movie called Star Wars Rebels The Siege of Lothal. And then season 2 of Rebels follows that, once again staying in proper chronological order. Next up is the movie coming out next year titled Rogue One, which takes place right before the start of the original trilogy. And finally, next in the timeline is Episode 4, A New Hope, which is followed by a whole bunch of new comics in the Marvel line. Starting off this list of comics is the 5-part Princess Leia comic, followed by the 5-part Chewbacca comic, titled respectively after their starring characters. After those two comics comes the novel Heir to the Jedi, and then a few more comics, starting with the comic titled Just Star Wars in its first 6 issues labeled The Skywalker Strikes arc, which is running alongside the first 6 issues of the Darth Vader comic. Next up is issues 8 through 12 of the Star Wars comic, which is the Showdown on Smuggler's Moon storyline, followed by Darth Vader issues 7 through 12, Shadows and Secrets. Then finally, the new Darth Vader arc, Vader Down, which has another 6 issues in the run. Next up in the comic book stories is the Lando arc, which is a 6-issue story that followed Lando on one of his many adventures. Now the timeline calms down a little with Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, and then Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, with nothing crazy happening in between them yet. We're almost there now because the stuff that happens next happens directly after the credits roll on Return of the Jedi. It's a 4-part comic story called Star Wars The Shattered Empire, and at the same time that this story is going on, a novel entitled Aftermath is happening. Following both of those, we have the Star Wars Uprising mobile game that is on Android and iOS. And after all of this, we have the new movie. Episode 7, A Force Awakens. Now keep in mind, this is only up to 2015, and going into 2016, 17, and the following years afterwards, we're gonna have a lot more stuff being plugged into the timeline. So we'll probably have to do one of these with each Star Wars movie. Anyway, luckily it's not as convoluted as the Legends timeline is, because that's a video entirely in itself. Did you know Chewbacca dies in that one? Anyway, leave your thoughts in the comments down below, and we'll see you next time right here.